Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson. This week, I discuss Toxic Substances Control Act developments with my colleague, Dr. Richard E. Engler, Director of Chemistry for Bergeson and Campbell and the ACTA Group, our consulting affiliate. You know, the United States Environmental Protection Agency's implementation of the 2016 Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act amendments has been a dynamic, evolving, and often unpredictable work in progress for almost 9 years. Given the new administration, we are at a most uncertain time because of the lack of clarity regarding what the new leaders at OCSPP will do to address new chemical review concerns, risk evaluations under TSCA Section 6, risk management actions resulting from those evaluations, and other determinations. As our listeners know, all final risk management rules are being challenged, and the disposition of those cases is the subject of considerable speculation. So also is OCSPP's consideration of not yet final risk evaluations and how the new administration intends to interpret TSCA Section 6 in general. There are growing calls for legislative action to remedy Lautenberg's deficits, particularly in the area of new chemicals, another important variable that is destabilizing the status quo. Rich and I discussed all these topics and many more. Now, here is my conversation with Dr. Richard Engler. Rich, welcome back to the studio. You are such a crowd pleaser. Everybody is interested in your words of wisdom on TSCA and everything else that you have to offer. So why don't we just dive right in?
Great.
So a lot as we go to record this podcast in early February, there has been a lot of development since we had our firm webinar on what to expect when you don't know what to expect in a new administration. President Trump campaigned on a lot of different topics, but no one more so than on diminishing or eliminating federal regulatory restrictions that, in the administration's view, are burdensome and unnecessary. Do you expect significant deregulatory actions, and if so, in what areas of relevance to our listeners?
Well, I do expect some changes under the new administration. There are clear statutory mandates under TSCA, and EPA is going to have to meet those mandates. I do expect to see changes in the existing chemical framework rule, which is now final, but as you noted up front, is subject to legal challenge. In particular, I expect a reversal of the single determination construct, where EPA currently makes a single determination for each substance that it evaluates, regardless of whether it finds some or many or most of the conditions of use to be not an unreasonable risk.
That's the so-called whole chemical.
Whole chemical approach is the old name for it.
Right.
Now it's called single determination. There's debate about whether what is the meaning of TSCA Section 6, and is single chemical required, or is it an option? I don't know if the framework rule will proceed to oral arguments and maybe a court decision, or if the new administration would seek to remand it and reissue the rule. I think more likely the latter, but
the remand seems more probable, but who knows?
Yeah, but I mean, the litigants might argue, like, no, we want to proceed. We want legal clarity. We want the court's clarity on the meaning of some of these.
Right, but you would need DOJ's acquiescence to that.
Absolutely. So question mark there. But that is a change that I do expect to see one way or another. There's also a lot of discussion about EPA's assumption about PPE use, or should EPA assume PPE use, or should EPA assume no PPE
being personal protective equipment.
Personal protective equipment, in particular gloves, and to a lesser extent respiratory protection. And I think there's really a conflation between evaluating whether a risk exists in the absence of PPE, and when EPA and if there is risk without PPE, must EPA issue a regulation requiring PPE use? So if EPA evaluates and finds that glove non-use it leads to a risk to workers, should EPA be looking at the OSHA requirements and saying, well, glove use would be required under OSHA, and therefore a TSCA requirement to use gloves would be duplicative. And that's not to say that there aren't, consumers certainly don't use gloves. So if EPA finds that consumer dermal exposure would be an unreasonable risk, then EPA cannot issue a requirement for consumers to use gloves. Consumers are not protected by OSHA. So that's a different regulatory outcome. But generally, what we're seeing in EPA's risk evaluations is that it's the lack of when EPA has found unreasonable risk when industrial workers don't wear gloves in particular. And
That the record often shows there's no basis to believe they aren't being used.
and EPA
Right.
says, well, we have no evidence that people are not wearing gloves, and yet they assume that they're not wearing gloves. And so again, evaluating whether there's a risk without gloves is different from issuing a regulation requiring glove use. So that's I just want to point that out, that there's a difference between the assumption in the risk evaluation and the assumption in the risk management. Another big question is the extent necessary, and this is one of the questions in particular in asbestos and methylene chloride, which are the more mature litigations. And the question is, if EPA finds a workplace chemical protection plan, a WCPP, is sufficient to protect against the risk. So if EPA issues an exposure limit, an inhalation exposure limit, and let's say EPA's got the justification to require particular glove use, if the WCPP is protective, as EPA has stated that it is, does EPA then have the legal authority to go beyond that and say, well, we're going to ban it anyway? So you get to continue to use this substance for 6 months or a year or a couple of years, but then it's going to be banned. And in the interim, you have to use the WCPP. So does that go beyond extent necessary? I mean, is the extent necessary a floor or a ceiling or both? And I think because we've discussed this internally here at BNC, we think it's both, right? It's the floor. They do have to go that far. But once they've met that burden, they don't have the authority to go further. So that's another key question that I think we'll see.
It seems pretty primed for judicial interpretation.
Exactly.
But again, whether cases proceed to oral argument and judicial determination or remanded back to the agency are very separate propositions.
Absolutely.
We know this administration is looking for less regulatory burden on industry, particularly in areas where it's thought to be excessive or unnecessary. We also have heard, some rough calculus that for any directive or regulatory initiative, the administration would be looking to deregulate or unburden industry maybe by a factor of 10. So for every new rule, there would be 10 that are extinguished. That's probably more a reflection of the administration's views as it is, not so much a 10-to-1 ratio, similar to what we had in Trump 1. But if true, how do you think that might affect the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention?
Well, there was a similar order in the first time around. My recollection was that regulations that were required by statute were exempted from the repeal
Directive,
2 or
right.
repeal 10, repeal however many to enact 1. I don't know the details this time around if that's written into the executive order or if there's been any interpretation of the executive order to say if a statute such as TSCA or FIFRA requires regulatory action, if that would trigger then deregulation of some number to make up that difference. It would be especially problematic for new chemicals because when EPA issues an order, then EPA is required to issue a SNR. So that SNR is definitely rulemaking. So would EPA have to go find 10 SNRs to undo to issue this SNR that's required? I don't think that's a reasonable expectation. But what's the administration what's the White House going to push for? I don't know.
Well, and I personally haven't heard a lot of that. We've all heard that, industry is burdened and less regulation is better. But I guess we'll just have to see. There's so much going on coming out of the White House these days. It's hard to keep track.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot of uncertainty over at OPPT. There's always uncertainty during transitions. This one is more fraught, I think, than most, and we just have to wait and see how things play out.
Well, adding to the, gee, what's going to happen, and as you correctly noted earlier, Rich, the five final risk evaluations, asbestos, methylene chloride, carbon tet, PERC, and TCE, are out there. Do you expect changes in those five final risk evaluations, or what if you were a bookie, where would you be putting your money?
Well, so we talked about extent necessary. So they all suffer from extent necessary issues. Also, there are a couple of them that have, we think, some serious best available science questions. So are the rules based on the best available science? If EPA has departed from the best available science, then their scientific underpinning of their exposure limits is really called into question. And the final risk management rule right now is the only opportunity to challenge the use of EPA science. I mean, there were cases where the EPA selected the lowest number, the lowest toxicity level from several tox studies, even though those results have not been able to be reproduced. So that really calls into question whether that level, that very low level, is the best available science. There are also cases where EPA selected toxicity endpoints where it's questionable whether they're relevant to humans. Um, and EPA's even dismissed concerns raised by the Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals, the SAC, with little or no robust rationale.
Mhm.
They sort of hand wave over. They're just like, oh, we're going to do this, and it gives the appearance that they were selecting values to come to a conclusion of unreasonable risk, as opposed to objectively selecting values to evaluate risk. And so that undermines the robustness of the risk management rules, and also to the risk evaluations, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the new administration might want to reevaluate those scientific decisions, and maybe they tweak the exposure limits as opposed to rescinding the whole rule. They're just like, okay, the exposure limits, instead of X, it's going to be this number Y
Mhm.
that's based on a better interpretation of the science. I think it's less likely that the new administration will revisit their assumptions about whether exposures from other pathways that are managed by other statutes. So that was something that EPA did the first time around. Basically, Clean Air Act protects against air exposures, and Clean Water Act protects against, or Safe Drinking Water Act protects against drinking water exposures. That was challenged. I think EPA correctly switched to looking at those exposures, but I think there's also an opportunity, and EPA gave a signal in their 1,4-dioxane risk evaluation that they were going to rely on Safe Drinking Water Act to protect against drinking water exposures for 1,4-dioxane. That makes sense to me. I think it's more efficient, and I think we'll see. I mean, we saw that shift under the Biden-Harris administration. I think we'll see that continue under Trump-Vance, where they'll look for other statutory authorities rather than relying solely on TSCA.
In addition to the risk evaluations out in final, there are several out in draft. Same result, unclear? What do you think?
Well, the risk evaluations are they're more easily re-reviewed.
Sure.
They're not right. They're either the draft or final. EPA can pretty easily pull back. I mean, again, the incoming Biden administration pulled back the final risk evaluations and then spent nearly 3 years reissuing them. So I hope they won't get delayed that much. I think the formaldehyde in particular, I think, is going to get redone. 1,4-dioxane may get redone. Um, and and if they're draft, then right, it's obviously it's up to the new administration to interpret the comments from the draft and issue the final. So those will definitely get a new look, and not sure how different they'll be. Again, it depends on the underlying facts. Right, I remind myself and remind listeners. Right, there is a statutory mandate for EPA to do risk evaluations, and to take risk management action to address risks identified. If the administration fails to do risk evaluations and fails to protect, then I'm sure there'll be litigation on those points. So what we need robust, scientifically and legally robust risk evaluation and risk management rules, so that we're not getting whipsawed from one administration to another, and continuing getting pulled back and re-reviewed. Let's get it right. Let's get it on the books. Let's get those protections in place.
You've mentioned a couple of times, to the extent necessary, EPA is required by law to address unreasonable risks to the extent necessary
Mhm.
to be protective of human health and the environment. What, in your view, is the harm of being more precautionary or perhaps more precautionary than what a risk benefit statute like TSCA would suggest, and to go to a very high protective level, both from a scientific perspective and a legal one?
Well, so that right, if you pick the lowest number, regardless of how scientifically robust it is, and you say, "Well, I'm picking the lowest number because I want to be protective," but then the question is, how much time and effort and resources, monetary resources, human resources, are we putting to protecting against what might be a non-existent risk? So if
Mhm.
right, if you have this very low you have one study that shows very low level of effect, but you can't reproduce it. Let's just for sake of argument say it's 3 orders of magnitude. So 1,000-fold lower if you rely on that study, but all the other studies say no. It's in fact it's this number that's 1,000 times higher. You're spending a lot of time and money to protect against what may not be a risk at all. And if you are not just business, but if you're a water authority or if you have a well, if it's private property in your well, and the EPA is saying, "Oh no, you got to make sure you're below a part per trillion of this contaminant in your well," and in fact, it could be, and you're below, and the real level is a part per billion, and you're well below that. Are you going to? You would have to. Are you going to spend the time and the money to further purify your drinking water? Like, is that a good use of your?
Right, chasing it to the nth degree,
Yeah,
right.
to just because, oh, it might actually be 1,000 times lower. So getting the science right leads us to the correct protective level, which leads us to the correct level of effort to protect. And frankly, it's what's required by the statute.
Let's talk a little bit about new chemicals, a topic near and dear to you personally, Rich, given your history at EPA and dealing with green chemistry. You last month testified before Congress at a House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee. Did a great job.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed listening to your testimony and reading it, which, of course, is up on our website for those of you who haven't yet done so. Do you think the newest administration is going to meaningfully address the concerns that you raised in your testimony? You and others, your other witnesses, also raised concerns about not just the pace of new chemical review, but how some of the scientific principles that EPA is applying is actually deterring innovation by disallowing into the commerce new chemicals that are promising, but enter the market laden with restrictions that make them less competitive. And what do you think the result of that hearing is, and what do you think this administration is going to do in that regard?
So, well, let's say, so there are two separate questions there. One,
Mhm.
I expect some incremental change. If we look back at the numbers during the first Trump administration, because remember, the Trump administration came in 2017, about 6, 8 months after passage of Lautenberg, and there was the EPA was still getting the new policies and procedures in place. But what we saw in that time frame was 85, 88% of PMNs getting regulated in one way or another, either with an order or with a non-order SNR. So
Right.
the vast majority of PMNs were being regulated. And then with the change of administration, that number ticked up and it's now about 92%.
Mhm.
So 85 or 92% is not a huge difference. It's different, but it's not like overwhelmingly different. A lot of that related to data that was provided to EPA to OPPT in 2018 or so that
Mhm.
showed that glove non-use was rare in industrial settings, and so they incorporated that into what they reasonably foresaw. Of course, Dr. Friedhoff reversed that shortly after she took the
June of
helm, June
2021.
of 2021, and she said no, that assumption is gone. And so now, of course, almost every chemical has dermal risk if you assume exposure that the level EPA assumes, and so almost every PMN is coming out with an order that includes a glove restriction or a glove requirement. Um, so, I mean, that might swing back, but again, it's not going to make a huge difference. Other than that, I mean, the that was basically the only case that departed from their standard practice of if there's a hazard, there might be a risk, and therefore they're going to issue a regulation. I don't see a substantial change there, absent change in the statute. Now, I might be wrong that
Mhm.
there hasn't been, well, the only Section 5 court case was Enhance, and that's not really related to.
So quirky,
Yeah, it's not
the
really related
circumstances are
to a
very
bread and butter
unusual.
PMN, so
Right.
the decisions there didn't really affect it. But, what is reasonably foreseeable? How likely does something have to be or how unlikely does it have to be to make the threshold of not likely? These are still unanswered questions, and that's why in the hearing I was asking, "Hey, Congress, you need to step up and you need to tell EPA a lot more clearly, this is what's meant by these terms." Um, I don't. OPPT might return to the non-order SNR model. I thought it was a creative,
I did too, as a
a
creative
creative
workaround.
solution.
Right. Maybe you could, for our listeners' benefit, explain what a non-odor snur is.
In early on, 2017 or 2018, in the old days before Lautenberg, EPA would if EPA felt it did not need testing on a substance, but it did feel there was a need for protective measures, they would do a non-order SNR. They would drop the chemical from review so that it could proceed to market, but they would issue a SNR for whatever protective measures. Frequently, it was a surface water concentration limit, but
Mhm.
it might be a variety of things. They would issue a SNR to protect against whatever that condition of use was. Um, with the advent of Lautenberg, EPA was required to consider what was reasonably foreseen. And what they decided is if they could issue a SNR, um, if they could propose a SNR to allow what was intended, but it would prohibit the reasonably foreseen conditions of use that'd be a problem, that limited those prohibited conditions of use to they were no longer reasonably foreseen, and therefore EP could make a not likely determination. So it was called a not likely based on SNR. So they would say, here's the SNR condition, no release above 100 parts per billion.
For example, yeah.
Just as an example, and as long as that was met, the substance was not likely, and so it could proceed to market, but there would be that protective
So it was
measure
ki
in
it was kind
place.
of a legal construct.
It was an interpretation of what it means to be reasonably foreseen that allowed them to avoid the order and get straight to the protective measures in the
Right,
SNR. Right now they issue an order and then a year or 2 years later the SNR comes out. And so you have this long delay between
right.
the decision and the protective measures being throughout the supply chain.
And that fell into disfavor with the new administration, the Biden administration, that was disallowed.
Yeah, their interpretation is no, that's not a reasonable read of what reasonably foreseen means. And if there's a risk, there must be an order. And of course, if there's a hazard, there may be a risk. So everything's getting an order.
So that might be something the new administration brings back into vogue,
Yep, might.
which we will see. And let's talk a little bit about that House subcommittee hearing that you testified at. I was taken by surprise that one of the first legislative hearings, certainly of that committee and its subcommittee, was on TSCA. I don't wanna read too much into that. It might have been a marriage of convenience because there were entities that had kind of coalesced around a number of issues that
Mhm.
are deeply concerning to the industrial chemical community, but maybe you can help our listeners understand, the significance of the hearing and some of the feedback that you have received since testifying.
Well, so I think it does reflect a measure of the importance.
Mhm.
I think that there's a recognition that well, certainly fees are up during this Congress, so there will need to be some legislative action if the fees are going to be renewed.
By September of 2026.
Correct. The
Right.
September 30th, 2026, the fee authority expires.
Right.
So if they're going to address the fees, are they going to make tweaks? And I think
Mhm.
what I heard in the hearing is that um, uh, witnesses were not looking for radical changes. They're looking for clarity, some tweaks
Mhm.
to make it clear, Congress to be more explicit to EPA about some of these key terms. We can avoid some of the litigation if Congress can be more explicit about its intent. So I think the hearing happening that quickly, I think it partly just what could be ready to go early, but I think it does reflect somewhat the importance of the issue, and we'll see what happens in the Senate. But I do expect a Senate hearing. Um, but I thought there was personal bias. I thought there was good interaction.
Yeah, yeah, no,
I
there
thought
was.
there
It's
was some
fabulous.
actual probing of some of the
Mhm,
substantive issues, and not just all political posturing. So I'm hopeful that that might move the needle
mhm.
on, again, what does Congress want EPA to do with TSCA, and maybe we get some of that clarity that we've been seeking now for eight and a
Mhm.
half years.
Right. No, I was impressed, Rich, with, in particular, your testimony and how
Thank
you
you.
had bipartisan engagement
Yeah.
on, what is unreasonable risk and how might the new chemicals program kind of frustrate innovation at a time when we really need innovative new chemistries. Maybe you want to linger a minute on vinegar, since
But it's
that
a
was the word of the day.
Well, so there are two issues that I was really trying to get across, and vinegar is just a useful
Well,
example.
back up for people that haven't watched the testimony. You used it as an example of
Yeah, yeah. So the question is, does every hazard necessitate EPA issuing a regulation under TSCA to protect
right,
health and the environment? And under EPA's current policies, and one of the congressmen, and I forget who it was, one of the Democratic congressmen, really challenged me. Like, we're not talking hypotheticals, but in our experience, I mean, we've had a number of cases, PMNs, and the new chemicals program has said this is corrosive. We agreed that it was
right.
corrosive,
It
and they said
is.
if it's corrosive, it may not be present in consumer product above 3%. That is their policy.
Right,
Might they have exceptions for one reason or another? Maybe, but that's the policy. So vinegar is acetic acid in water. Vinegar is 5% acetic acid. Typically, it's, on the internet, it says it's between 4 and 6%. And acetic acid is definitely corrosive, and even vinegar is corrosive.
mhm,
If you leave it on your skin, you will get skin burns. If you
mhm.
if you if you drink it straight, you will get chemical burns in your digestive system. There's no question that it has this hazard. The question is that a hazard that EPA should be protecting against using TSCA, or is it like, what? There's certain things that don't require that sort of statutory intervention by EPA. Either CPSC will cover it or warnings will cover it. I mean,
Right,
it's hard to stop people from doing really foolish things with
right.
something that has
Clear,
a pretty common
palpable hazards.
well, I mean, it's a common, well understood, easy
Right.
to warn, easy to protect against hazard. Do we really need TSCA to protect against that? And I think that's the message that really got through,
This is
to some people
Representative
like,
Peters?
no, well, it got to a number of Democrats,
Right.
but it's like, yeah, and do we need TSCA regulations to protect against this, or is this something that, that's not an unreasonable risk, or we have other things that'll protect against that. The other point I made about green chemistry, we've had some fabulous
Mhm.
PMNs for things that are either listed on or identical to things that are listed on EPA's Safer Choice, Safer Chemical Ingredient list. And EPA's issuing orders, even orders to prohibit consumer use.
Right, which is
So,
super counterintuitive.
yeah, to me, that is an indication that the way EPA is interpreting Section 5 is disconnected from the way TSCA should be working. And so but that's clearly EPA's interpretation. And so one of the things that I hope, if Congress is going to take action, that they make it explicit that while EPA is prohibited from considering costs or other non-risk factors, EPA is required to consider risk-based
Mhm,
benefits,
mhm.
reduced hazard, pollution prevention benefits, reduced risk. If those facts exist in a PMN, EPA not only should but must take that into account when they're deciding whether or not there's an unreasonable risk and whether or not there should be a regulation.
Let's, circle just a minute back on litigation. We had noted before that all final risk management rules are being litigated in
Mhm.
various circuits,
Mhm.
some of them in a single circuit as a result of a lottery because of multiple petitions for review. That risk management rules are subject to litigation surprises no one at all, right? We
We
all
fully expected it,
fully
yeah.
expected that. But maybe you can help our listeners understand what are some of the key issues and what are your expectations?
Well, so as we talked about already, the, key terms like extent necessary, did EPA rely on the best available science? And I think the answer there is mixed. I think extent necessary, I think EPA's gone beyond extent necessary probably in all 5 of them. Um, there is, I don't know if what is reasonably foreseeable will
I
pop
hope
up.
I hope it does.
I hope it does too. I
It's
just
so
think I think it's
frustrating.
less likely. It's a lot more esoteric. So I'm not sure that the litigants, that the
Yeah.
plaintiffs will get into that, or if they'll rely on some other issue. And to your point earlier, are these going to actually go forward with litigation, or will they be remanded? So if they don't go forward and we don't get the court's interpretation of these terms, then we may end up with a rule that more closely fits what we think the rule is, or certainly what the new administration thinks the rule means. But is that going to does that comport well with the
Litigants' expectations, yeah, I
and
mean,
and what the and in the end, what does the statute say, and what does the court think that the statute
right.
says? So I think that right, those are issues are there. The framework rule, as we also talked about, that I expect remand rather than litigate, and then there are more. I mean, there's a lot that's out there.
Indeed, and more to come.
Yep.
No conversation, Rich, would be complete without mentioning our favorite word, PFAS.
Hmm.
Do you see a lot of federal regulatory initiatives relating to PFAS going forward, a slowdown? Everybody asks me about 8A7, is it coming back? Might there be a longer lead time, another 8-month extension, for example? What are your thoughts on PFAS?
So let's start with 8A7. I don't know if there'll be another delay. I mean, the last delay was they were having problems standing up the reporting system.
Right.
That was a technological problem. They may still be having that problem. I don't know. We haven't heard. So they might delay it again for that reason. They might delay it again to seek to do rulemaking that they might extend the reporting period enough that they would then do rulemaking to add some exemptions back. I really don't know I sort of don't think that that's going to be extended. But it's hard for me um, to read those tea leaves because I don't know what the political pushback is going to be. I don't think. I mean, that we might see one of the C8 PFAS, like PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, or one of the other long chain perfluoroalkyl carboxylates be uh, slated for prioritization under TSCA Section 6, so that they would actually then do the risk evaluation and seek to do what EPA tried to do in the enhanced case. So that might go forward, but I think that's unlikely. We've sort of seen what a lot of the prioritization candidates are. EPA is going to have their plate full with those.
Yeah, for sure.
But there might be a political push to put a PFAS into Section 6. I don't know. Um, we'll probably get more PFAS test rules. That's a long-term project
All right.
where EPA is seeking to gather data. So I expect there to be some more of that. I don't know if it'll be this year. I mean, there's a lot of work to do under the test rule they did last year. Do they have the bandwidth to do more? I don't know that, but I'd probably this year or next year expect another PFAS test rule. Um, the TRI additions to PFAS to TRI, a lot of that's automatically triggered, so expect that to continue. Um, that's what I expect at the federal level. The states, I think the states are going to continue. I think we're going to see more and more states doing what Maine, Minnesota, California, Washington.
Absolutely.
We're going to see a proliferation of that. Hopefully, there'll be more consistency between and among them so that the requirements, you don't have this huge patchwork of requirements. You just have consistent
Yeah.
requirements across
I mean, there
states.
seems to be much more consistency between and among state initiatives with regard to the definitional issue and what are the elements of commercially unavoidable uses, for example. It's the disjoint between state and federal definitional issues that I don't see any way of harmonizing.
Well, and I mean, part of it is the state definitions are not based on risk. They're based on what a legislator wrote down,
Right.
and a lot of people are like, oh, we want the OECD definition, but the states have departed from that as well.
Right.
So,
Right.
there is this disjointed, even and there is some disagreement between and among the states about what a PFAS is, and some states are putting fluoropolymers aside. So there's not that consistency, but the idea of an unavoidable use, there does seem to be some
Mhm.
gelling around that. And so I think as people learn what is, um, where the PFAS are used and what the wide variety of PFAS are, we'll see PFAS being squeezed out of some particular uses, some of the higher exposure uses, and especially the higher hazard PFAS.
Mhm.
Whereas some of the lower hazard PFAS, I think we may see less action there. But there's still a lot of flux. But with the very strict, some of the states that are taking a very strict view, when they start to deal with the currently unavoidable uses, they're like, okay, maybe they're starting to understand that maybe there are really some uses that don't pose the sort of risk that they thought they did.
Mhm.
That detractors of PFAS are like every PFAS is the same. That they're like, yeah, that's not actually true,
Right.
and we really need it here, and so let's squeeze it out of a couple of these uses where we really don't need it, and there are these greater exposures. So that's where I expect most of the action to be, and again, hopefully there'll be some consistency.
Well, Rich, always a pleasure. We so enjoy hearing your thoughts, what's keeping you busy. I want to remind our listeners that our 2025 forecast is on our website. Rich's testimony and the testimony of the other witnesses at the hearing on the 22nd is also up there, and a bunch of other stuff on our Tosca blog, and just all the materials that we offer our listeners, clients, and friends. Rich, thank you for joining me. Really enjoyed the opportunity.
It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks again to Rich Engler for speaking with me today about all things Tosca. There is sufficient drama here for a new Netflix series, and Rich Engler would have a starring role. Stay tuned, as there is a lot unfolding. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld at Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.